Let me paint you a picture of absolute British madness. It's 2009. The global economy has just face-planted into a recession. And Aston Martin looks at this financial apocalypse and thinks, you know what the world needs right now? A £1.05 million car. Not dollars, pounds. 750 horsepower from a naturally aspirated V12 developed with Cosworth. The same Cosworth that built Formula One championship engines. A top speed of 220 miles per hour. Hand-rolled aluminum bodywork where a single fender takes 3 weeks to shape. And they would build exactly 77 of them. But, and this is a but, the size of Buckingham Palace, for nearly $2 million. Aston Martin paired this engineering symphony with a transmission that Top Gear magazine called, and I'm quoting directly, a war crime. Welcome to the Aston Martin ONE-77, the most expensive proof that British engineering can be simultaneously brilliant and baffling. To understand why the ONE-77 exists, you need to understand where Aston Martin was in the mid-2000s. This wasn't the confident Aston Martin of today. This was a company that had been through more owners than a used Corolla. Ford had bought them in 1987, pumped in billions to revive the brand. And then the 2008 financial crisis hit like a sledgehammer. Ford needed cash, and Aston Martin was suddenly on the auction block, again. Enter Ulrich Bez, the German CEO running Aston Martin since 2000. Bez convinced a consortium of investors, including 2 Kuwaiti investment groups, to buy Aston Martin for roughly $925 million. And his first order of business? Build a halo car so spectacular, so outrageously ambitious, that it would cement Aston Martin among the true supercar elite. Not a competitor to the Ferrari 612, a competitor to the Enzo. The brief was simple but insane. Build the ultimate Aston Martin. The target? 77 cars. A number chosen because it was quintessentially British, like 007, but 1 digit more exclusive. The price? £1.05 million, rising to £1.15 million by production. And here's the audacity, to even be considered. You had to put down £200,000 as a deposit. $250,000, non-refundable, just for the privilege of being on the waiting list. And somehow, impossibly, in the middle of a global recession, they found 77 buyers willing to do exactly that. For the engine, Aston Martin turned to Cosworth. And this wasn't just a casual collaboration. Cosworth had been building championship-winning engines since the 1960s, their DFV-powered cars to 12 Formula One World Championships. For the ONE-77, Cosworth took Aston's existing 6-liter V12 and essentially rebuilt it from scratch. Larger displacement, 7.3 liters, new internals, including a nanoscopic low-friction coating that eliminated traditional cylinder liners entirely. The result was 25% lighter than the standard V12, yet produced 50% more power. Let's talk numbers, because these numbers deserve to be savored. 7,312 cubic centimeters, that's 446 cubic inches in American. 750 brake horsepower at 7,500 RPM. 750 Newton meters of torque, that's 553 pound-feet, at 5,000 RPM. Dry sump lubrication for a lower center of gravity. And here's the detail that makes engine nerds weep with joy. The motor was mounted 100 millimeters lower than any previous Aston V12, and positioned 257 millimeters behind the front axle centerline. Front mid-engine perfection. But Aston didn't stop at the engine. They went equally berserk on the chassis. They contracted Multimatic, a Canadian company that builds chassis for Le Mans prototypes, and, fun fact, develops the suspension for the Chevrolet Camaro Z28. Multimatic created a carbon fiber monocoque tub weighing just 180 kilograms. That's 396 pounds for a structure that forms the entire passenger cell. This wasn't just strong. It was stiff enough to make Formula One engineers nod approvingly. And then there's the suspension, which is where Aston Martin genuinely broke new ground. The ONE-77 was one of the very first road cars, and certainly the first front-engine GT, to use true inboard pushrod suspension with Multimatic DSSV dampers. DSSV stands for Dynamic Suspension Spool Valve, technology that had been used in DTM racing cars and high-end motorsport, but never in a production vehicle. These dampers are fully adjustable, and here's the wild part. Aston Martin engineers would custom tune the suspension setup for each individual buyer based on their driving preferences. Now let's talk about that bodywork, because this is where British craftsmanship goes absolutely mental. Every body panel is hand-rolled aluminum, shaped by actual human beings with actual hammers and English wheels. Each front fender, just one fender, takes a single craftsman 3 weeks to form from a single sheet of aluminum. The lights, bespoke. The wheels, exclusive to the 177. The doors, unique. Even the badges were hand-milled. This wasn't manufacturing, this was sculpture. Production ran from 2009 to 2012, though actual deliveries didn't begin until 2011. Exactly 77 production cars were built, plus 11 development prototypes. Of those production cars, only 9 were right-hand drive, making UK spec 177s rarer than hen's teeth in a tornado. There was also a special Q-Series variant, 7 cars with even more exclusive personalization options, though mechanically identical to the standard 177. And here's a fun bit of trivia. There's technically a 78th 177 out there. Development prototype number 10711, the last of the 11 test cars, was used for high-speed testing at Nardo, hammered around the Nürburgring, and displayed at Goodwood. When it retired with nearly 24,000 miles on the clock, a private buyer purchased it and sent it back to Aston Martin for a complete restoration. It's now registered in the United States, one of only 7 177s in the country, and probably the highest mileage example in existence. The design, penned by Marek Reichman, took Aston Martin's signature aesthetic and evolved it into something almost alien. Those LED headlights, developed specifically for the 177, gave the car a face unlike anything else on the road. The massive side strakes channeled air from the front wheel arches. Functional aerodynamics that also looked absolutely menacing. The rear diffuser wasn't just for show. It generated genuine downforce. This was form and function, Italian drama filtered through British restraint. Aston originally targeted 1,500 kilograms, which would have made the 177 extraordinarily light for its power. Reality proved more difficult. The production cars tipped the scales at around 1,630 kilograms, roughly 3,594 pounds. Still impressive given the car's dimensions and that massive V12 up front, but 130 kilos heavier than promised. British optimism meets manufacturing reality. The power-to-weight ratio still worked out to approximately 460 horsepower per ton, firmly in hypercar territory. Each 177 received a numbered chassis plate, 1 through 77. Each owner could personalize their car through Aston Martin's Q division, choosing from thousands of leather combinations, trim materials, and accent colors. Some buyers commissioned special paint formulations, one-off colors that would never be repeated. This wasn't just exclusivity. This was automotive haute couture. Your 177 would be your 177, identical to no other. When your 177 was ready, you didn't just pick it up from a dealer. Aston Martin flew you to their Gaydon headquarters for a handover ceremony. You met the craftsman who built your car. You signed the underside of the hood. You received a custom-made 177 travel bag set. The documentation included a leather-bound book detailing every specification. This was buying a car the way monarchs commission portraits, with ceremony, ritual, and an appropriately massive bill. Let that sink in. A company betting its future on £77 million sculptures during a recession. British confidence or British delusion? The answer might be both. Now, performance. Aston Martin claimed 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds, though independent testing by Evio magazine and Top Gear suggested 3.7 seconds to 62 miles per hour was more realistic. Still, 3.7 seconds from a naturally aspirated front-engine car. That's hanging with the Ferrari 599 GTO and embarrassing most Lamborghinis of the era. But the top speed, this is where things get properly insane. Aston Martin initially estimated 217 miles per hour, but when they actually tested it in December 2009, the 177 hit 220.007 miles per hour, 220.007. And if you think that decimal isn't intentional, you're not paying attention. That's a James Bond Easter egg baked into the car's verified top speed. The British actually engineered a 007 reference into their performance testing. Here's where it gets weird though. Aston Martin essentially banned journalists from testing the ONE-77. There were no press cars, no official media drives, nothing. Top Gear magazine had to beg a private owner in Dubai to borrow their car. Evo tested one belonging to a wealthy collector in Wales. This was a nearly $2 million car that its own manufacturer refused to let the automotive press properly evaluate. CEO Ulrich Bez reportedly wanted to maintain the car's mystique, which is corporate speak for, "We don't want anyone writing about the gearbox." When Evo finally got their hands on one, their instrumented testing revealed some fascinating numbers. 0 to 62 in 3.7 seconds, consistent with Aston's claims. 0 to 100 miles per hour in 6.9 seconds, which put it between a Ferrari Enzo at 6.7 seconds and a Koenigsegg CCX at 7.7 seconds. Not bad company to be keeping. The car weighed 1630 kilograms, about 130 kilos more than Aston's original 1500 kilograms target, but still light for a front-engine GT with this much power. Let's put this in perspective with its contemporaries. In 2011, when 177s were being delivered, the Ferrari 599 GTO made 670 horsepower. The Lamborghini Murcielago LP674 SV also 670. Even the brand new Lamborghini Aventador only managed 700 horsepower. The 177's 750 brake horsepower genuinely was the most powerful, naturally aspirated production engine on the planet at that moment. It wouldn't be surpassed until the Ferrari F12 Berlinetta arrived in 2012 with 730 horsepower. And even then, that was still 20 horses behind the Aston. But raw numbers don't tell the whole story. Evo's test driver described the power delivery as brutal and addictive. The V12 pulling relentlessly from 3,000 RPM all the way to the 7,500 RPM power peak. Top Gear called the engine extraordinary, a masterpiece of naturally aspirated engineering. The exhaust, stainless steel, produced what one reviewer called a symphony that makes angels weep. This was the last gasp of the big naturally aspirated era, and Aston made it count. The engineering behind the weight distribution was genuinely clever. That engine mounted 100 millimeters lower and 257 millimeter rearward created a near-perfect front-to-rear balance. Most sources cite approximately 50-50 distribution, though Aston never published the exact figures. The carbon fiber prop shaft ran through a magnesium torque tube to the rear-mounted transaxle, keeping mass centered. This wasn't just a powerful car. It was a properly balanced one. And that racing-derived suspension? It transformed how the car handled. The pushrod-activated DSSV dampers allowed for incredibly precise tuning, with adjustments for bump, rebound, ride height, and spring rate, all possible electronically. Anti-roll bars front and rear kept the 1,630 kilogram mass under control. Pirelli developed bespoke P0 Corsa tires, 255/35 ZR20 front, and a massive 335/30 ZR20 rear, specifically for the 177's unique weight distribution and performance envelope. The brakes were equally serious. Carbon ceramic matrix discs, 398 mm at the front with 6 piston calipers, 360 mm at the rear with 4 piston calipers. This was stopping power designed for repeated high-speed deceleration, the kind of system you'd expect on a car that could actually reach 220 miles per hour. No fade, no drama, just physics-defying retardation. Inside, the 177 was predictably spectacular. Hand-stitched leather everywhere, exposed carbon fiber structural elements visible as design features, bespoke everything. But here's the catch. This was a front-engine GT, not a mid-engine supercar. You got reasonable trunk space, proper visibility, even a somewhat civilized ride. This was a car you could theoretically drive across Europe, assuming your fuel budget matched your car budget. Speaking of fuel, Auto Express managed to average 6.2 miles per gallon over 500 miles of testing. 6.2. That's roughly 38 liters per 100 kilometers for those keeping score in metric. At 2011 fuel prices, that's painful. At 2025 fuel prices, that's a second mortgage. But then again, if you're spending $2 million on a car, you're probably not clipping fuel coupons. So the performance verdict is clear. the 177 absolutely delivered on its engineering promises. The engine was a masterpiece, the chassis was revolutionary. The suspension was motorsport grade, the brakes could stop time itself. This was, without question, the most technically advanced Aston Martin ever built, which makes what comes next even more baffling. I need you to take a breath here, because we're about to discuss what happens when a $2 million masterpiece meets a transmission that Top Gear called utterly inexcusably crap. Still with me? Good. It gets worse. Now we arrive at the elephant in the room, or rather, the war crime in the transmission tunnel. For reasons that remain deeply mysterious, Aston Martin paired this technological tour de force with a 6-speed automated manual transmission. Not a dual-clutch unit like Ferrari and Lamborghini were using. Not a proper manual for the purists. A single-clutch automated manual from Graziano. The same basic technology that was already considered outdated in 2009. Top Gear magazine, the only publication to conduct a proper road test, was absolutely savage in their assessment. They called it, and again, I'm quoting directly, utterly, inexcusably crap in automatic mode. They described shifts as desperately slow, with particular venom reserved for the hesitation when engaging second gear. Remember, this is a magazine that generally loves Aston Martin. This wasn't bias, this was genuine horror. And then came the quote, the one that will follow the 177 into automotive history. Top Gear's reviewer, after struggling with the gearbox in traffic, wrote that the transmission was a war crime for nearly $2 million. For a car with the most powerful naturally aspirated engine ever built, for a chassis co-developed with Le Mans prototype specialists, Aston Martin gave you a gearbox that an automotive journalist compared to crimes against humanity. To be fair, let's provide some context. In 2009, when the 177 was being developed, Ferrari's dual-clutch transmission was still relatively new. Lamborghini was using similar single-clutch units in the Murcielago. But by 2011, when 177s were actually being delivered, the Ferrari 458 Italia had arrived with its lightning-quick dual-clutch. The technology had moved on, but Aston was stuck with what they'd engineered 3 years earlier. And here's the question that haunts every 177 owner. Why no manual option? Aston Martin builds beautiful manual transmissions. The DB9 and DBS were available with proper 3-pedal setups. A $2 million flagship, the ultimate driver's Aston, with no manual transmission available. The decision remains one of the most controversial in modern Aston Martin history. The reality, according to multiple owner reports, is that the transmission is tolerable in sport mode. Keep the revs up, shift manually with the paddles, and the delays become less intrusive. But around town, in traffic, the experience was apparently frustrating enough that most owners simply didn't. These became garage queens, automotive art that rarely ventures onto actual roads. Fast forward to 2020, and Aston Martin built a one-off car called the Victor. Based on the 177 platform, with an even more powerful Cosworth V12 producing 836 horsepower. And what transmission did they choose? A manual. A proper 6-speed manual gearbox. It's almost as if Aston Martin finally admitted, 11 years later, that maybe their transmission choice for the 177 was a mistake. Evo magazine, while more diplomatic than Top Gear, still noted the transmission as a weak point. They called the car demanding, and emphasized that extracting the best from it required commitment. Translation: you needed to work around the gearbox rather than with it. For a car costing more than most houses, you'd expect the opposite. Auto Express, who managed 500 miles in a 177, described it as beautiful, vicious, and noted they never wanted to stop driving. But their review conspicuously spent more time discussing the engine and handling than the transmission, which tells you everything you need to know about the gearbox situation. This raises a fascinating question. Can a single component ruin an otherwise perfect car? The 177 has a masterpiece engine, revolutionary chassis, groundbreaking suspension, breathtaking design, and a transmission that reviewers compared to war crimes. Is that one flaw enough to tarnish the legend? Or does the brilliance everywhere else compensate? Most owners, from what we can gather, have made peace with the transmission. They drive in sport mode, they use the paddles, and they focus on the V12 symphony and the sensation of speed. But the fact that peace had to be made, rather than simply enjoyed, speaks volumes about the 177's complicated legacy. If you're enjoying this journey through British automotive madness, the masterpiece engine paired with the catastrophic gearbox, hit that subscribe button. We cover the most fascinating, and sometimes most frustrating, supercars ever built. And trust me, the maintenance costs we're about to discuss make the transmission look like a minor inconvenience. Now, let's talk about owning a 177. Because if you thought the transmission was the only potential headache, oh my sweet summer child, you are not prepared for what comes next. Remember that 78th car, development prototype TO7-111? The one that became the highest mileage 177 in existence with nearly 41,000 kilometers? That car has taught us more about 177 reliability than any other, because its owner actually drives it, and the repair bills have been, let's say, educational. Let's start with the windshield wiper motor. On a normal car, a wiper motor might cost you $50, maybe $100 for something premium. On the 177, $10,000. $10,000 for a windshield wiper motor. This is a component that exists solely to move two rubber strips back and forth, and it costs more than many used cars. But wait, it gets better. The air conditioning compressor? $45,000. $45,000. And here's the kicker. To replace it, you have to remove the engine. The entire 7.3-liter Cosworth V12 has to come out of the car to access the AC compressor. That's not maintenance, that's an archaeological excavation. Now, to be fair, these astronomical figures come from one specific car, the heavily used prototype. Most 177s sit in climate-controlled garages accumulating maybe a few hundred miles per year. But the point stands. When things do break on a car limited to 77 units, replacement parts aren't exactly sitting on shelves at AutoZone. Other documented issues include problems with the electric mirrors, motors failing with no easy fix. The pop-up infotainment screen has been noted as unreliable. Something about the mechanism that raises it from the dashboard, and general electrical gremlins, because British cars and electronics have a relationship status of, it's complicated. Regular servicing has to be performed by Aston Martin's Works division. There's no corner mechanic option here. Oil changes require draining the dry sump system properly. The carbon ceramic brakes, while long-lasting, cost a fortune to replace when needed. And any suspension work requires expertise in motorsport-grade DSSV systems. Insurance, if you can even get it, runs into the tens of thousands annually. Many insurers simply won't touch a car this valuable and this rare. Those that will require agreed value policies, detailed security systems, and often restrictions on usage. Want to drive your $2 million car to get groceries? Better check your policy first. Storage is another consideration. These cars need climate-controlled environments to prevent issues with the carbon fiber and aluminum. Humidity fluctuations can cause problems. Temperature extremes are bad for the electronics. Most owners maintain dedicated spaces that cost more per year than some people's apartments. But here's the silver lining, and it's a significant one. The 177 has appreciated dramatically since new. Original buyers paid around £1.15 million. Recent auction results show cars selling for 1.4 to 1.8 million euros, with asking prices sometimes reaching 3.5 million. Unlike most supercars, this one has proven to be a genuinely good investment. This appreciation reflects genuine collectability. The 177 represents a specific moment in Aston Martin history, the bridge between Ford ownership and the current era. It's the most extreme expression of Ulrich Bez's vision, and with only 77 examples, demand consistently outstrips supply. Every collector wants the rarest Aston, and this is it. So you're looking at a car that costs $10,000 to replace windshield wipers, appreciates faster than real estate, and requires removing the engine to fix the AC. Only the British could create something this magnificently impractical. Let's appreciate what Aston Martin achieved with the 177's design, because this is genuinely exceptional work. Chief designer Marek Reichman led the team with a clear brief: create the most beautiful car Aston Martin had ever produced. And whether you love the result or not, the ambition was realized. Every surface flows into the next with organic precision. The massive hood, housing that front mid-mounted V12, stretches forward like a predator. The side vents channel air around the carbon fiber monocoque. The rear haunches swell dramatically over those 335mm wide rear tires. And the exposed carbon fiber panels, visible through glass sections of the hood, remind you this isn't just style, it's engineering made visible. The design world agreed with Aston's self-assessment. The ONE-77 won the design award for concept cars and prototypes at the prestigious Concorso d'Eleganza Via d'Este in 2009. It took home the Good Design Award from the Chicago Athenaeum. Auto Express UK named it Best Design. This wasn't just pretty, it was award-winningly pretty. But what makes the ONE-77's design truly special is how it was built. Those hand-rolled aluminum panels. We talked about the 3-week fenders, but the same attention applied everywhere. Each surface was massaged into shape by skilled craftspeople using techniques that date back decades. In an age of computer-controlled stamping, the ONE-77 was built like a bespoke suit. Aston Martin could have mass-produced the panels, stamped them out efficiently, and pocketed the savings. Instead, they chose to build each car like a piece of art. The entire production run took 3 years, from 2009 to 2012, for just 77 cars. That's roughly 2 cars per month. McLaren builds more F1s in a week than Aston built ONE-77s in their entire production run. This exclusivity was entirely intentional. Bez understood that at this price point, customers weren't buying transportation, they were buying membership in an extremely exclusive club. 77 people in the world would own a ONE-77. That's fewer than most country club memberships. For collectors, that scarcity is the point. The ONE-77 appeared at every significant automotive event from 2009 to 2012, always drawing crowds. It became Aston Martin's calling card, proof that the British could compete with Italian exotics and German hypercars. Even if journalists couldn't drive it, everyone could admire it, and admire they did. More importantly, the ONE-77's technology trickled down. The carbon fiber expertise developed for this car informed later Aston Martin platforms. The Cosworth partnership demonstrated what the V12 could achieve with proper development. The DSSV suspension technology proved viable for road cars, and now appears in various applications. The ONE-77 was a laboratory wrapped in art. Today, ONE-77s are almost never seen. Most live in private collections, climate-controlled, appreciated but rarely driven. Occasionally one appears at a concours event, where it invariably wins prizes. Even more rarely, one comes to auction, where bidding wars ensue. Finding one for sale is harder than finding a parking spot in Monaco. A handful of owners, like the person with prototype 711, actually use their ONE-77s. These brave souls have racked up real miles, experienced both the highs and lows, and generally report that the highs outweigh the lows. The engine remains magnificent decades later. The chassis still impresses. Only the gearbox remains controversial. So what is the ONE-77? Ultimately, is it a flawed masterpiece? A triumph undermined by a single terrible decision? Or is it proof that perfection is impossible, even with unlimited budgets? The answer depends on whether you're a driver who fights the transmission, or a collector who admires the art. From an engineering standpoint, the ONE-77 was a genuine triumph. The most powerful naturally aspirated production engine of its era, verified. Revolutionary carbon fiber chassis, delivered. World-first inboard suspension technology, achieved. The specifications weren't marketing fiction. They were documented reality. Aston Martin promised the most extreme car they'd ever built, and on paper, they delivered. The execution, apart from that transmission, was equally impressive. Hand-built with genuine craftsmanship. Limited production maintained as promised. Quality befitting the price point. No corners cut on materials or construction. This was a properly built $2 million car, not a badge-engineered exercise. But that transmission, it remains the ONE-77's permanent asterisk. You simply cannot have a car this expensive, this engineered, this exclusive, paired with a gearbox that reviewers call a war crime, without that defining the conversation. Every discussion of the ONE-77 must acknowledge this contradiction. Brilliance and blunder, in perfect British harmony. As an investment, the ONE-77 has been spectacular. Original buyers have seen values nearly double. In a world of depreciating automobiles, the ONE-77 appreciates like fine art. Whether driven or stored, owned for years or flipped quickly, this car has made money for everyone who touched it. The accountants are very happy. The legacy is secure, complicated but secure. The ONE-77 proved Aston Martin could compete at the hypercar level. It demonstrated British engineering and craftsmanship at their finest. It created 77 rolling sculptures that will be treasured for generations. And yes, it also proved that even $2 million can't buy a perfect gearbox. In the end, the Aston Martin ONE-77 is the most British car ever built. Not because of the hand-rolled aluminum or the Gaydon factory origin, but because it combines absolute brilliance with inexplicable compromise. Magnificent ambition alongside baffling decisions. A 750 horsepower symphony conducted by a tone-deaf percussionist. It's impossible to love it completely, and impossible not to admire it entirely. The ONE-77 isn't perfect, but by God, it's unforgettable. And that is the Aston Martin ONE-77. 750 horsepower of brilliance wrapped around one inexcusable gearbox. If you enjoyed this deep dive into British engineering madness, subscribe for more supercar stories. Drop a comment. Would you accept the transmission in exchange for that Cosworth V12? This is Supercar Chronicles, where even the masterpieces have footnotes.